Thank you, Paul. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a real privilege to be here. I've always wanted to be here. And I've come today from Charlottesville, Virginia. And I've had the privilege in Virginia of living in a house designed by Thomas Jefferson. And when you get to live in a house designed by Jefferson, it's like having Thomas Jefferson as your architect. And he never leaves the building. It's sort of like Elvis. And you realize that Mr. Jefferson saw himself as a designer, probably first, because all you have to do is look at his last design, which was his tombstone. And you'll notice that on it he only records the things he designed. It says, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, which matured into the Bill of Rights, and father of the University of Virginia. That's it. Anything missing? Can you imagine being President of the United States twice, and it's not important enough to put on your tombstone? He was only recording his legacies, not his activities. There was no mention of his jobs, just what he left behind. The Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the University of Virginia. Now, if we look at Mr. Jefferson's strategic intention, we have to recognize that we are Thomas Jefferson's seventh generation. The people in this room are Thomas Jefferson's seventh generation. And so what were the Founding Fathers thinking when they formatted the structure for our well-being? They were thinking out 200 plus years, at least. And when we look back, we can see that this is the case. There's a letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison in 1789. And he and Madison were discussing what the term of a federal bond should be. And Jefferson thought it should be one generation. And his logic was this. He said, the earth belongs to the living. No man may by natural right oblige the lands he owns or occupies to debts greater than those that may be paid during his own lifetime. Because if he could, then the world would belong to the dead and not to the living. The world would belong to the dead. We have an emergency. If we look out 200 years and think about our legacy, we're finding that the signals coming back from the future, not just the feedback from yesterday, but the feed forward from tomorrow, is not good. In fact, it's tragic. And when we look at a situation where people are caused to call for revolution, perhaps it is time for a new revolution. This is a question of design, it's a question of legacy, and it's a question of intention. Because design is the first signal of human intention. Uh-oh. Is there something cutting that off on there? Sorry. This is not good. It was perfectly set up. I'm sorry. We'll have this fixed for us in a second. And you're all going to know how. I'll keep going while we get this sorted out. So the question at this point about our intention has to be, what is our intention as a species? So it's not just a question of specific design, but a question of general design, of what our species now intends. Because if you look at our species, we now control 99% of the planet. 99% of the large mammals are under human management. And so what we realize is that we can affect, with persistent toxification, with endocrine disruption, with global warming, climate change, ocean acidification, plastics in the oceans. We can affect the entire planet. So the question has to become, what is our design? What is our intention? So the question that we're asking, and is trying to be asked up here, is how do we love all of the children of all species for all time? And it's not just our children, it's not just our species, and it's not just now. And how would we do that by design? Now this might sound like an emotional plea, but it has a very focused need. Because right now what we realize is that human designs are fundamentally tragic. And that when we look out into the future, we realize that these tragedies are of our own making. They are literally of our own making. We make them. And if we say that they're not part of our plan, if you all come here tonight and I come here today and we say we didn't plan on causing global warming as we came to a talk, we never planned on that. It's become part of our de facto plan. It's the thing that's happening because we have no other plan. We need another plan. The problem is that we're playing a game without an end in sight. So it's like playing chess without knowing you're supposed to take the king. How do you play the game? You're just moving pieces around on a puzzle board. There is no end game. But the ironic thing is that we don't have an end game either. The reason is we don't want the game to end. But we need another strategy. We need a strategy of hope, not a strategy of tragedy. We want the game to go on forever. We want the infinite game. So, humans have evolved two fundamental syndromes of survival. One, do you need help from up here? I don't think so. They're concentrating. One is the guardian. The other is commerce. And do you need me to resync the, do I unplug it and then just stick it back in? Okay. Happy to do that. So we can do this without falling off the stage. Sorry, everybody. We worked so hard to get this just right. Okay. Ready? All right. So if we look at these two syndromes, we realize there's the guardian and commerce. The guardian is like a university, it's the government, it's the state, and it has fundamentally different characteristics than commerce. It's very slow, it's very serious. The guardian reserves the right to kill. It reserves the right to be duplicitous. The CIA is legal. Commerce, on the other hand, is very quick, it's very efficient, it's very effective, it's highly creative, and it's fundamentally honest, because you can't do business with somebody very long unless you're honest. Now, if you get the two together, you get what Jane Jacobs calls a monstrous hybrid. If we get the guardian into commerce, we slow it down. A regulation can be seen as a signal of design failure. A regulation can be seen as a signal of design failure. Because what's happening is the state is getting involved in business and saying, excuse me, we never gave you the right to kill. If you want to release mercury or neurotoxins, we'll tell you at what rate you can dispense death. A regulation is a signal of design failure. On the other hand, if we get commerce into the guardian, as we see from campaign finance reform concerns, we corrupt the guardian. So when these two get together, we realize we get these monstrous hybrids, like the mafia. You know, it does business and reserves the right to kill. It's a problem. We need to keep these two things separate. So the job of the guardian is to secure local society. All sustainability, like politics, is local. That's why it's so exciting to see what's going on in Nashville, because your sustainability can only be measured on your own terms. And the aggregated global sustainability will only be measured by the aggregated local sustainabilities. The job of commerce is to generate prosperity and wealth. And for a lot of environmentalists, they say that growth is not good. In nature, growth is good. And we have a form of income that we can use to drive growth. Energy drives growth. We'll talk about that a little more later. The question is, how do we generate prosperity? The prosperity of the planet comes from the sun, from an energetic perspective. And we can tap into this amazing resource as a form of income. So let's talk about what principles we would use to format a new design. And this requires immense humility because we don't know what to do. And anybody in the room has trouble with the concept of design humility. So it's unfortunate in my profession, for example, that the word architect and the word humble have not appeared in the same paragraph since the fountainhead. But if anybody here has trouble with design humility, just remember it took us 5,000 years to put wheels on our luggage. We're not that smart. So the program that we've developed and the principles we use are three. Waste equals food. And this is about eliminating the entire concept of waste. This isn't about reducing waste or being less bad. It may have those components. What it's about is eliminating the entire concept of waste so that there is no such thing as waste. Think about a cherry tree in the spring. And think about what it would mean to think about reducing its waste. Can you imagine going up to a tree in the spring and saying, what are all these blossoms, how inefficient, what a waste. And yet we realize that we love this waste. And it's beautiful. It goes to the ground, it becomes soil again, and comes back to us. This is not an efficient thing, it's an effective thing. And its waste can be celebrated. It eliminates the entire concept of waste. Now, in technology, we could do this too. So what we're looking at is situations like this one in China where this woman is about to expose herself to 4 pounds of lead, toxic mercury, in order to recover some copper. On the other hand, working with Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's enterprise, and Shaw Carpets, the carpet company, the largest in the world by a factor of 2, and BASF, the world's largest chemical company, we've now developed a carpet made of nylon 6 and a thermoplastic polyolefin that's infinitely recyclable. The top is a chemically recyclable to caprolactam, the bottom back to thermoplastics, polyolefin. So we end up with what we call a technical nutrient. More on this in a minute. So the idea that we'd have waste equals food, biology, things back to soil, waste equals food, technology, things back to technology, and nothing else that could destroy living systems. The second principle would be to use current solar income. We rely on natural energy flows like nature that give us the possibilities, as we will see in a little while, for astonishing new creativity on the part of the human species. We're seeing it already. The wind generator, and I've now gone on the board of GE's Eco-Imagination program. The wind generator is now cheaper to function and create kilowatt hours in the Great Plains than burning natural gas. Now, this is a really important moment in history. Because when it's cheaper to make renewable sourced energy than it is to burn fossil fuels, something has happened. And let me show you what I think has happened in a diagram. In 1973, when OPEC was formed, the price of oil was about $15 a barrel, and it was taken up to $35. And when Sheikh Yamani, forming OPEC, was asked 2 questions, which I'll never forget. As a student, when I was at Yale, we were watching all this from afar. He was asked, when do you think we'll see the end of the age of oil? And his answer was, I don't know that we'll ever see the end of the age of oil, but I can tell you this, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. The oil age won't end because we run out of oil. Oil is an incredibly valuable resource. It is ancient stored solar energy. It is a gift. It is tremendously valuable for plastics, for polymers, and for petrochemicals and other objects of human need. The silliest thing we could do with it is burn it and cause a liability. Now, if we look at the other thing that he was asked is, what do you think we'll see when we see alternatives to oil now that you've put the price up? And his remarks were really prescient. He said, well, what we'll do is keep the price high. As alternatives come along and become cost-effective, we'll just then drop the price of oil, collapse those investments on Wall Street, and then they'll take another 10 years to recover, and we'll do it again. And all you have to do is look at the last 30 years, and bingo. Just like he said they would do. They tracked it exactly. Now, what's interesting today is that if we look at this as today, what we realize is that we're at this inflection point where all of a sudden these investments are at the point where the cost of wind energy has left the building. Wind is now as cost-effective as fossil fuels, and so in certain places, certain instances. So what we'll see now is the countries that have the oil, now that China is on board, have an amazing opportunity for us in history, which is that if just as easily as they could drive the prices of renewables out of business, for example, they could drive them into business. They could take the same economic force that they now have to use to kill alternative investments in order to invest in those alternative investments by letting the price float. This is an amazing moment in history now that China has come on board as the second largest energy need on the planet, and it'll create demand for fossil fuels that will not abate and will not need to be dictated by U.S. Interests. The third principle is to celebrate diversity, and that we recognize the interdependence of human design and the natural world. And what we see with diversity is the importance of both cultural diversity, biocultural diversity, and biocultural diversity in all instances, because we want cultural diversity. When Charles de Gaulle was asked what it was like to be the president of France, he said, "What do you think it's like trying to run a country with 400 kinds of cheese?" And we want 400 kinds of French cheese. What we don't want is 400 kinds of French plastic. So in biology, we want to celebrate diversity. In technology, we want to celebrate coherency. But it's a chance for all of us to express ourselves. Look at everybody in this room. Unique individual expression. Look at all the opportunities of Nashville to be a local place. It's phenomenal. I didn't come to Nashville to get a repeat of Charlottesville. I came here because you have unique value propositions that you can offer, both culturally and physically. Now, if we look at the design of buildings, which is where it was my day job, and we celebrate diversity, this building would be considered a liability by a bird, whereas this is our corporate campus for San Bruno for the Gap, and these are the ancient grasses of San Bruno. We had to get permission from the federal government to go on lands to collect the seeds so that we could have a native grassland. Because you can't just go to a nursery and say, I want the native plants of this place. Right? Or you couldn't before. This is now a nursery which sells native seeds. So our technological goal is quite simple. It's a delightfully diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, water, soil, and power, economically, equitably, ecologically, and elegantly enjoyed, period. Now, what part of this don't you like? I have had the privilege of presenting this program twice at the White House in the current administration. And it was interesting. I was in front of 40 federal executives from every department and agency, and I presented this, and I was asked what I thought of clean nuclear power. I am a big fan of clean nuclear power. I'm especially fond of nuclear fusion. I think we should spend trillions of dollars on nuclear fusion immediately. And thank goodness we have a nuclear reactor exactly where we need it, 93 million miles away. It's 8 minutes. It's wireless. So what is the problem? I was born in Tokyo, Japan. I grew up in Hong Kong. So I come from a place that has 6 million people on 40 square miles. And when you grow up with 6 million people suffering from cholera, typhoid, typhus, yellow fever, scarlet fever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, people dying of starvation. I remember going with my mother to the money changers, and we would stand, she would stand there getting the money changed into Hong Kong dollars. I would be staring at a very old woman holding a dying baby, looking for sympathy for her begging bowl. And some days the babies were dead. This was ordinary life. This is the way it was. Every fourth day we got water during the dry season. We only got water one day in 4. And the relationship of the Chinese to the land is completely different than ours. This piece of dirt has been farmed continuously for 5,000 years. Now, how do you farm the same piece of dirt for 5,000 years if you don't understand nutrient flow? In ancient China, it was impolite to leave somebody's house after dinner without leaving a deposit. You were taking their nutrition. Why do the Chinese eat everything that's self-mobile? Because you eat your protein before it slithers or flies away. This is a very tight equation. And for 5,000 years, the Chinese have understood how to keep this cycle moving. And only in 3 generations have they lost that and are moving toward Western chemical agriculture. It's only been 3 generations. So this understanding of nutrient flow is very close to us in our cultural memory. It's much closer than we think. It's not that far back. Think about your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and what they did during the Second World War, for example. This isn't that far back. Think of the Depression. It's not that far back. The issue of resource management is fundamentally part of our nature because we're hardwired to be opportunists. If you think about our history as a species, we came up as hunter-gatherers. The Earth could support about 400 million hunter-gatherers with natural systems. We now have 6.4 billion people. We will need technical nutrition for the other 6 billion people. We will need materials that cycle through industrial or agricultural process in order for us to even celebrate every child that's born. And if we're going to love all the children, then we have to love every child that's born. So it's not going to be good enough for environmentalists to say, oh, population problem is a natural resource problem. Because that means you look at a child being born in India and you say, oh, a natural resource problem. The minute that a child is a natural resource problem and is not loved is the minute human rights cease to exist. So we have to, as a species, find a way to celebrate the birth of every child. This is a design problem writ large. And the issue of resources become really important because the question becomes, what does it mean to be native to this place? And this place is the planet. And if you ask a native person and talk about natural resources, they will tell you what you call your natural resources, they call their relatives. So this question of becoming in relationship to natural resources is fundamental. And I had the great fortune of living in my childhood summers in the Puget Sound of Washington State, where my grandfather had been a lumberjack. So I'm working off big tree karma here, real big trees. And at the same time, my grandparents they composted, they were really careful with aluminum foil, with rubber bands, they put away vegetables for the winter, they raised oysters, kept the spring clear. They were very careful in a world of abundance to make sure that abundance was maintained. And then I went to high school in Connecticut, on to Yale to study architecture, and I studied in a building of this style. This is Le Corbusier in Marseille. It's the Unité d'Adaptation. And the style is affectionately known in my business as brutalism. If we look at the modern building, and I studied modern design, I'm a modernist, is that we look at this by 1928, Mies van der Rohe in Berlin, and it's an astonishing image. And yet we do have to ask the question, where is South? And it may have worked in Berlin, but we built it in Houston. I had the chance to give the opening address to the largest gathering of architects in history in Chicago in 1993. 10,000 architects in one room. And I looked at the audience and I said, how many people in this room know how to find true south? I got 4 hands. 10,000 architects. How many people in this room know how to find true south? Doing better than they were. Isn't that amazing? Here we are walking around with GPS systems. We can go anywhere we want to, and yet we don't know where the sun is. It's amazing. And if we look at this building, perhaps it's an oven. And if we look at the materials that are inside it, we realize that so few things have been designed for indoor use. And as we seal up our buildings, we realize more and more that they're off-gassing, or we're getting concerns over the materials that abrade and so on. And we realize that previously the solution to pollution was dilution. And that today we can look and say, but by design, why is this here in the first place? And then we realize with the energy situation in 1973, the hegemony of oil has appeared. And then we look at the clean materials and we realize that after 15 years after we did the Environmental Defense Fund, Business Week did an article about our work on the cover of their magazine. The problem is that this is such a shrill message. We don't use the word should and use the word must. We use the words could and can. We can do this the right way. Being terrified is not productive if it doesn't get you up out of your chair and get you to work. So how do we do this work? This, as has been pointed out by Al Gore, is the most published image in the history of the human being. This happened in 1969 when I graduated from high school. And from my perspective, away went away. Remember how we used to throw things away? Could somebody point to away? Where's away? Well, perhaps we found a way. It might be right here. This is an image from NOAA. There's the equator. There's Hawaii. This is known as the Pacific Gyre. Like gyrate. Big low pressure area out here over the Pacific. Scientists 2.5 years ago, actually 3 years in January, found 6 times as much plastic as plankton. 6 times as much plastic as plankton at the center of the Pacific Ocean. Where'd it come from? West coast of the United States. Out of our stormwater systems. 6 times as much plastic as plankton. What else are the scientists telling us? They're telling us that the pH of the oceans, we can tell from the Ross Ice Shelf cores that the pH of the oceans have been at 8.8 down to 8.2 historically, in the last 2 million years. Now, if we then look at where it is today, it's at 8.06 due to the carbon, 48% of the anthropogenic carbon released by humans since 1850. And the expectation by the end of this century is it'll be at 7.9. Now, at 7.9 pH, calcium carbonate goes into solution, which means we dissolve the coral reefs. So we've heard about the climate change issue, but 48% of that carbon has gone into the oceans as a sink, and it will dissolve calcium carbonate, carbonic acid. This is not a good design. If we looked at these tragedies and said we intend for them to happen, we're doing really well. We're just doing great. Let's dissolve the coral reefs. Fabulous. What a program. But if that's not what we intend, if we don't intend to drop out the bottom of our food chain, then what is our design? We've now found pollution in people. Here's a website that you can look at. These are random Washingtonians, and you start to look at what was found in them. Absolutely unbelievable. Pesticides, PCBs, so on and so forth. And look at the check marks. So what is the new design, and what are we going to do? Well, let's look at the natural world and start looking for rules and regulations and laws. As an architect, one of the first ones I look at is this one, which is gravity. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. So we have to follow that as architects. What else is there? Well, we wrote this book, Cradle to Cradle, about this. And the book is a plastic book. It's the first polymer trade book. And the reason we did it in plastic is explained in the first chapter. It says this book is not a tree. Because if you stop and think about it, from a design perspective, think about a tree. If you're all designers now, you know, we've just put wheels on our luggage. So now I would like you, since we're so skilled, let's make something that makes oxygen, sequesters carbon, fixes nitrogen, distills water, provides habitat for hundreds of species, changes colors with the seasons, accrues solar energy as fuel, makes complex sugars in food, creates microclimates, and self-replicates. How's that? How many things do you think humans have made recently that make oxygen? Let's think about our design. So the Cradle to Cradle is about this protocol. And it imagines that we don't have to walk around British Columbia looking up at giant trees and saying, well, we can smash these and write on them. Because as Margaret Atwood, the Canadian poet, says, we write our history on the skin of fish with the blood of bears. We use the same criteria as most people in our designs. We use cost, performance, aesthetics. Can I afford it? Does it work? And do I like it? But to that we've added, is it ecologically intelligent? Jefferson's life. Is it fair? Liberty. And is it fun? Pursuit of happiness. And we do this in a competitive environment. But we look at competition from its etymological roots. Take a look at this word. It comes from competare, which means strive together in Latin. So like Olympic athletes, we train with each other, then we compete. So we share our information with other architects, then we compete. We look for a level playing field, then we compete for fun. Survival of the fittest has also been misinterpreted by the business community because it doesn't mean destroy the other. If you read on The Origin of Species, what Darwin was talking about is survival of the fittest. It's about how many niches get created and how well things that connect to them. And in that context, growth is good. And so what we realize is that in nature, growth is good. How many environmentalists do you know have said growth is good recently? The problem is, if all we grow is asphalt, then it can be seen as two words assigning blame. So, let me do some science as a non-scientist, as a non-scientist, and then I'll start to show you the business cases and the design. When I took a course, I'm here at a university, so I'm going to talk about my university experience. I took a course at Dartmouth, affectionately titled Physics for Poets. It was for those of us not going on in science. And I remember asking the physics professor two things. One was, why did Hiroshima disappear? And my other question was, why was Einstein afraid? And after spending some time with the special theory of relativity, it became clear that c is a really big number, 186,000 miles per second. So if we square it, it's almost infinite, which means that if m is in any way a positive, then e is almost infinite, which means that there's a huge amount of e in a very little bit of m. That's why Hiroshima disappeared. Now, if we translate that into an architectural framework, what it tells us is that E is the sun in physics. It's physics. And kinetic energy transforms into photons. It comes to the Earth 8 minutes later. And we have 5,000 times more solar energy striking the Earth's surface than humans will ever need. So we will solve the energy problem. We have solar income. If you all went home tonight and you had 5,000 times more income than you needed to operate, I think you'd figure out your home economics. We have 5,000 times more sun striking the Earth's surface than we need as a species. We will solve the energy problem. What we won't solve is the mass problem. Remember, E equals mc squared. So it takes a very large amount of E to make a very small amount of m. We don't have mass income. Occasional meteorites, some cosmic dust. That's about it. So if we toxify the mass, we'll never recover from this. If we take all the chromium out of South Africa and put it in little holes in the ground, future generations will look back and say, what happened to all the chromium? And why did you use it to toxify us? Now, if you take energy and connect it to mass, we can see that the Earth is actually inorganic chemistry. And it gets stricken by solar energy, and magical things start to happen, which is biology. Something that Einstein never dealt with. He called it magic. And Crick and Watson found DNA in 1953. And then Crick spent 9 years looking for what he called the nature of vitalism. What does it mean to be a living thing? What does it mean to be alive? And he concluded you had to have 3 characteristics to be alive. You had to have growth. You have to have growth. Even as a precondition for replication or stasis, you must have growth. The second is, in order to grow, you have to have a form of income and a free form of energy to support the growth. And that in nature, that growth comes from sunlight. That's the income, to have growth. And in order to do that, you need an open system of chemicals operating for the benefit of the organism and its reproduction. An open system of chemicals operating for the benefit of the organism. So what if human artifice could be like a living thing? What if we could design things that were around growth, free energy from sunlight, and an open metabolism of chemicals? Then the question is no longer growth or no growth, but what do we want to grow? And then we can choose what we want to grow instead of having it happen with the de facto plan. So, we have 2 metabolisms in this open system, and this is what we characterized with cradle to cradle. Excuse me. One is the biological metabolism that we all learned about in 3rd grade. The other is the technical. So biological, technical, nutrition. And if we're going to do that, then we're going to have to get down to the molecule. So we look at these filters. We have 19 fundamental criteria. No more cancer, no more birth defects, no more mutagenic effects, no more disruption of our endocrine systems. We want to know about disruption to our immune systems, carrier functions, allergies, various toxicities. We want to know, does it biodegrade? Is it persistent in the environment? Does it affect vertebrates, invertebrates, plants? Does it bioaccumulate? Is it toxic to soil? Does it contain heavy metals? We want to know exactly what it's made out of, where it came from, how much energy it took to make it, whether it had social fairness involved, was there animal testing, and does it affect the climate? Now, all of this discussion around the environment today, and there's so much of it focused on the climate, you'll notice that that's one of all these criteria. Using these assessment tools, which we developed in 1993, we did our first product, which was in the textile industry for Steelcase Corporation. And we looked at 8,000 chemicals used in textiles through those intellectual filters and had to eliminate 7,962. We were left with 38 chemicals, which we used to make this fabric. And it's now been selected for the Airbus 380 as the cleanest textile for an airplane, because it's so clean you can eat it, which is good news for frequent flyers, because the food is bad or non-existent, and if you found yourself at 40,000 feet with a fiber deficiency, you can eat your chair. As a result of all this, we've now got the 6,000 most commonly used chemicals by humans databased with a stop-go system based on red light, green light, and so on, where we can look at whether it's carcinogenic. This is a fire retardant brominated material. It's carcinogenic, so it's a red. And we can now look at the fractions of materials going into products down to the parts per million, parts per billion, and determine a safe and healthy design all the way from metals through polymers through natural materials. As a result of this, we've developed a supply chain tool which we'll be sharing broadly. Very soon we'll be releasing it to the world. And it's a supply chain tool that asks a whole series of these questions that we have to all the suppliers. So it's been developed with Nike over the last 10 years. Nike's been working on this for 10 years. We now are communicating with the top 3,000 suppliers of Nike with these questions, and then all the suppliers have to come back and answer them all. And so the community is building and building, and we work with about $1 trillion worth of businesses now who are going to be using this kind of tool. As a result, we end up with biological nutrient fabrics. In the case of this factory, the water coming out of the factory is now cleaner than the water going in, and what went in was Swiss drinking water. What used to come out was this. What now comes out is that. The fabrics are further filtering the water. And so if your factory doesn't produce anything that needs to be tested, there's nothing to regulate. So the costs were reduced by 20%, and it allowed the business to stay in business in Switzerland, whereas our textile industries here have mostly left. This is the technical nutrient carpet with Shaw carpet, the carpet that can become carpet again, truly, not just a carpet that comes back, but it's made with PVC. This is PVC free. And then there's another technical nutrient. This is a picture that my brother just took of the chair that's being, that's your door prize. This is the first cradle-to-cradle chair done with Herman Miller. This chair can come apart in about 10 minutes with tools you'd find in your kitchen drawer. All the materials have been fully characterized down to the parts per million, parts per billion. Comes apart and goes back to industry forever. Herman Miller invested $2 million just in changing the skins on the nature of the armrests from PVC. An amazing investment on their part, repaid right away by the marketplace. We have biotechnical nutrients. This is a car we did for Ford in 2003, the Model U, which is a privilege at Ford because it's the letter after T. It's the 21st letter in the alphabet, cradle-to-cradle car. And shoes with Nike, where we've been looking at various materials for shoe soles, and for example, that when they abrade, don't leave behind lead stabilizers, but leave it behind nutrition. So the uppers are polyesters, for example. This ad could be wear your old shoes in, your new shoes out. There is no finish line. Nike. Biotechnical nutrients, in the car, for example, are technical materials that go back to technology, biological materials that go back to biology, solar-powered powertrains, and so on. We've now developed a certification process for this, where we look at the materials for human intellectual health, as I showed. We look at their reverse logistics to make sure that they're going back into closed cycles. We look at the energy going toward 100% renewable, water towards 100% drinkable, and social responsibility based on commonly held values and beliefs on a democratic basis. We look at cradle-to-cradle products that we're now developing ourselves. The first is a greeting card to say hello to everybody with this, and it's a technical nutrient greeting card. It's a plastic. You open it up, you get it, it says Happy Birthday, Bill. I open it, I read it, I enjoy it, and then I put it back in the envelope, flip the envelope inside out, put it back in, and give it back to the mailman because it goes back to Shaw Carpet to become our carpet. So it's a technical nutrient greeting card, welcoming you to the next industrial revolution. We made this deal with the Postal Service. We're very excited about it. So now we have cradle-to-cradle certified products across the entire spectrum of human artifice, including most of the furniture companies in the office sector, window shades, carpets, concrete additives, diapers, skateboards. You wouldn't believe it. It's amazing. So what we're looking at, though, is a new definition of leadership in this space, because if we look at current systems for eco-efficiency, we realize there are projects that minimize. They're trying to be less bad, and being less bad is not being good. It's being bad, but less so. It's still being bad by definition. And what we find is that the people who are trying to do simply eco-efficiency and try and reduce their badness, it's like saying you could leave Nashville and head for Canada, or you could head for Mexico. If you found yourself going 100 miles an hour towards Canada, but you're supposed to be going to Mexico, it's not going to help you to slow down to 20. You're going the wrong way. So what we're looking at here is not just saying minimize, because being less bad is better than being more bad, that's for sure. But on the other hand, what if we could develop products that optimize and projects that optimize? So we can find that inflection point. And we do that by coming together to determine what is our optimal sustainability goal. Our job, what we get hired to do, is to imagine the perfectly exquisite in order to achieve the practically impossible. Our job is to imagine the perfectly exquisite. So when you look at a plan like Nashville's, and you look at what's happening here is the citizens of Nashville are getting together to start to try to imagine the perfectly exquisite in order to achieve the practically impossible. It's time for us to do that writ large on a global basis. So being less bad is better than being more bad, but being more good is better than being less bad. And if we could drive that inflection point closer to home, the faster we'd be able to do it. So we move from eco-efficiency to eco-effectiveness. Efficiency, if you look at Peter Drucker, the management consultant, he has a book called The Effective Executive, and on page 1, he says it's a manager's job to be efficient and to do something the right way, but it's an executive's job to be effective and do the right thing. Because if you're doing the wrong thing the right way, it might be pernicious. See, I work in Detroit a lot, as you can see, and there's a problem there, because what if, I have friends who think the Malcolm Baldrige Award for total quality is a plot on the part of the Japanese, because, it keeps us perfecting the wrong cars. So the real question is, are you doing the right thing first? And that's leadership. And leadership is really the thing that happens that you wouldn't have done on your own. It's that thing that takes you a place you never would have gone on your own. That's what leadership is. And so it's going to take us all to get together to figure out what sustainability looks like so that we can all lead each other. I'm just going to finish with a few projects. As I mentioned, I am an architect, so I'm going to show you a building for David Orr at Oberlin College, a building like a tree. This is a building that makes more energy than it needs to operate and purifies its own water. The project now makes 30% more energy than it needs to function and gives it back to the grid on an annual basis and purifies its own water. This was done with BP and students of Oberlin operate the building. This is the GAPS corporate campus. The building was built for a normal budget, same budget as a normal office building, and yet it has this magnificent green roof full of daylight and fresh air, and has turned out to have highly increased productivity, which ends up paying for the building. I'll be talking about this a lot more tomorrow. And then here is the River Rouge for Ford Motor. As you heard earlier, it's a 1,100-acre site. It's the first vertically integrated industrial facility of its kind in the world. Iron ore, coal, wood, rubber, things came in here, blast furnaces, rolling mills, stamping mills, tool and die, rubber, wood, glass, paint, body shop, finished cars. Like that. Now the joke in Dearborn is obviously this is a color photograph. So in taking on the project, we were given this project in public by Bill Ford, and I had to present it to their board for approval, the first phase, the auto plant. And I came in and said, I had a minute and a half. And Bill said, well, you take twice as long as they gave you, so 3 minutes. And I can do the math, it's a $150 million project, it's the first phase. And, $170 billion company, 11 board meetings a year, $20 billion a day, $150 million project, it's worth about $1.5 million. It's not that complicated, really. So I said, well, the project could be seen as for the birds, because these are the tools we're about to use. These are your native species. And yet you're a fiduciary body, so let's focus on the numbers. Stormwater had been budgeted by Ford to meet the Clean Water Act at $48 million. They already had the engineering done. $48 million sunk cost. And we found that using green technologies, green roofs, porous paving, parking lots, things like that, that we could do it for $13 million. So we saved Ford $35 million day one. That is the equivalent, with a Ford Taurus at a 4% margin, of an order for $900 million worth of cars. Approved. Next. So we built it. Here it is. It's the world's largest green roof. It's 10.5 acres. And this is a roof. Changes colors with the seasons, makes oxygen, absorbs particulates, cools the building, etc., and provides habitat for hundreds of species. This is the first avian species to arrive. These are killdeer eggs. They were there in 5 days. Can you imagine that? 5 days after the roof went down, the birds showed up, started nesting. Incredible. So I'll just finish with a city like a forest. And think of your own city. If a building could be like a tree, if a product could be nutrition, what would a city be like? Well, a city would be like a forest. So we've developed the Chicago principles for Mayor Daley. And what we're looking at is cities that could be the home of technical nutrients, the making of the cars, the making of the tractors, the making of the trucks, the windmills, the computers, the things that we want for human artifice. 80% of the world's people will be living in cities by mid-century, and 80% of those cities are on large bodies of water or on a river like your own. And what we realize is that we need cities that are organisms, that act like organisms, and they purify in the process, and they grow, and they create fecundity, and they create more and more niches, not less and less. It's a celebration, not a terrifying prospect. And we can celebrate all of these cities, because if we don't love the cities, we'll destroy the cities. If we don't love the environment, we'll destroy the environment. So what can we do to make these cities places of meaningful employment and meaningful production? And then looking at the countryside, how can it provide the biological nutrition for the city? And how can we return that biological nutrition to the country to refresh it? So I'll take you to China. I am the co-chair of the China-U.S. Center for Sustainable Development. And we have been working with the Chinese government and the U.S. government to try and share information about sustainable development between the two countries. And one of the reasons that you have to pay attention to China is that China will build new housing for 400 million people in the next 12 years. This is the equivalent of rehousing the entire United States in 7 years. That's how big this is. It's so big that they've made making a brick illegal in 174 jurisdictions because they'll lose all their soil and burn all their coal. It has been estimated by the Premier of China that if China continues its current urbanization at the current rate, that they will lose 25% of their farmland by the year 2020. 25% of their farmland by 2020. I had to check the numbers to make sure I heard what he said. 25% of their farmland by 2020. So this is a picture of my co-chair, Madame Deng Nan, who's Deng Xiaoping's daughter. She is now Party Secretary for Science and Technology. And the Memorandum of Understanding we're signing here is a document calling for China to adopt Cradle to Cradle as its national industrial policy. And why does this matter? Well, if China continues its current production as the lowest cost producer of just about everything under the current protocol, they will toxify. They will then send the materials to us, and we'll put it through one of the most efficient distribution systems ever invented by humans, especially Sam Walton. And we'll end up toxifying ourselves because most of the material that goes through our retail system ends up in a landfill within a few months. Then we will send them back the worst of it, like that computer monitor, because we can't deal with it. And in the meantime, you know, I remember when I was in college, this diagram was known as mutually assured destruction. We used to worry, we called it MAD. It was when we would throw a nuclear bomb at somebody and they'd throw one back and it was all over. Well, now we're doing it molecule by molecule. The one other wrinkle, though, is that what we've now decided to do is send them all our money. That gets really interesting. And anybody who thinks the Chinese are out to destroy the American economy is crazy, because the Chinese have no interest in destroying the American economy, because the first law of business is do not kill your customer. Number one. So the Chinese have no interest in destroying the American economy. What we're looking for is competition, where we strive together and thrive, because that way they can maintain their markets. And so the kinds of things we're looking at, before I just finish, let me give you one example. If China can use its low-cost production to produce solar collectors at less than 3 cents a kilowatt-hour cost, for example, which we're expecting to see within 12 years. If we can do that, then the United States can buy solar collectors and produce power at less than 3 cents, less than the price of burning coal. If that's possible, then what we'll find is that we get 4 jobs for every job they get. For every job making a solar collector, there are 4 jobs installing them, maintaining them, wiring them, and so on, cleaning them. And so we would get 4 jobs for every job they get. And we would have the most massive job creation program in the history of this country. And we would have an indigenous form of energy. And the Chinese would have something new to export, which they haven't been able to export, which is energy. They'd be exporting our own energy to us. And is it a threat? Well, of course not, because the Chinese can never capture an American photon. Okay? It's inherently national security. So they end up with a benefit, jobs, and an export product. We end up with a benefit, jobs, and an import product. Solar energy. Quite astonishing. So symbiosis, rather than competition, has destroyed the other. And we've already heard signals of this from the Chinese. This is a statement by the President of China to President Bush in Santiago de Chile in 2004. We should optimize the economic structure and advocate an environment-friendly way of production, life, and consumption, and bring about a virtuous cycle, which is how cradle to cradle is defined in Chinese, virtuous cycle, in both our ecological and socio-economic systems, the famous triad of sustainable development: ecology, society, and economy. We should put in place a conservation-oriented management system throughout the process of exploitation, processing, distribution, and consumption of resources, with a view to building a resource-effective, notice it's not efficient, national economy and a resource-effective society. A well-protected ecosystem underpins the growing productive forces and betters the lives for the people. How does this translate? Well, we're doing 6 city projects and 1 village project in China. I'm going to show you 1 city project. It's highly conceptual. We're just getting into the detailed discussions now on the contracts to build the center of the city. It's an existing city of 1 million people. They're about to double in size within the next 6 years. Here's the site we've been given. It's primarily monoculture of sugarcane. It's right around the corner from the city. It's an extension of the existing city. So here's the site existing, and here's our proposal. If you missed that, I'll show you again. There's the existing site, and there's the proposal. Now, how do we do this? Sleight of hand. First thing is to study the hydrology and look at how the water's going to move, what species are moving around, where do they move, where did they come from, where did they go. Right now it's monoculture. And where were they? And then we lay out all the water courses in the city to follow the natural water courses, so we don't need any pipes. And we don't build in any of the floodplains. And then we lay out the city's parks around these protocols. And then we study the sun and the wind and the air movements and how we're going to get daylight into every single apartment. After the parks are laid out, we lay out the mobility system so that the easiest way to move around the city is through the parks, bicycles, vehicles that are going to be operated by the elders. So a child that wants to learn how to play the violin can take a cell phone and type in the word violin, learn. And some elder who knows how to teach the violin will have typed in violin, teach. And somebody who knows how to drive and is retired can volunteer to be driving. And so we'll have these vehicles that are operated by the elders, because if we look at modern society, we expect that people will be able to live till the age of 130. And the retirement age of 65 was set by Otto von Bismarck at the turn of the century, because it was the age at which 98% of the German male population was dead. Right? So they had 2% of the population to deal with, the male population. So, the idea that we would live to 130 means that we have to find productive things for us to do, and mobility is the thing that's torn us apart. Wouldn't it be marvelous if that thing that tore us apart is the thing that brought the generations back together? Because right now, every kid under the age of 16 is treated like an incipient criminal and denied mobility. And everybody, and therefore, we get what we design. And then, on the other hand, we take elders and put them in file cabinets. And so we've taken the 50% of the population and separated it from the ability to move around and connect with each other. And so wouldn't it be marvelous if the elders moved the kids around and we could bring the generations back together? So that's the kind of thing we're looking at for these Chinese cities. We then lay out the building areas, and then we go after the waste equals food protocol, where we design the waste treatment plants to be sewage treatment plants that make fertilizer, so they're sold to the highest bidder. Instead of being a cost to the city to maintain sewage treatment and then put it in the river, we treat it as an asset, not a liability, where somebody pays for the privilege of having a fertilizer factory that makes methane gas that is used to cook for the city. We then take the compost and use it to restore biodiversity. It turns out a city can have, like Berlin, has 9 times the biodiversity of the surrounding farmland. A city can be incredibly diverse. We then look at how the city will be powered in the future by biomass and by solar collectors, and they'll be making solar collectors. And then I think the most dramatic thing we proposed that got everybody's attention was we proposed to lift the farms up onto the roofs and build a city underneath. So we'd have a vibrant city with mixed use everywhere, and then at the same time we would take this existing site, and there's the new city. Our goal is a delightfully diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, water, soil, and power, economically, equitably, ecologically, and elegantly enjoyed. Period. Thank you very much. Thank you. I know I've kept you a little over an hour. For anybody who needs to go, it's a good time. But I'd love to answer questions if there's anybody with the patience and the fortitude. Right. The question was, I gave the lecture to the White House. What kind of reaction I got? It was hugely positive. It was a federal executive order. It was the Greening of the White House initiative that had started under Bush 1 and was being extended. And we had 80 people there, 2 from every department and agency. And at the end of it, my host from the Office of Management and Budget got up and said, "Well, that was common sense." I said, "I thought so." And then immediately started dispatching people to Charlottesville. So we have had the Department of Defense, NASA, EPA, DOE, everybody's been down to Charlottesville. It was an incredible burden on us because, they all wanted to come down one at a time and take a whole day and do this kind of thing. And I don't, I'm a business that's trying to make a living. And so I asked them to come down in big groups so we could sort of try and cover a lot of territory at once. And it's been terrific. So we've done a study for what it would take to solar power the U.S. military, for example. It's the largest single user of energy in the world. And so we're studying what that would take, for example, because it would be more secure, could jumpstart an industry. It would be an order big enough to get things launched, things like that. So it's very well received because it's common sense if you think about it. There's nothing magical here. It's pretty straight ahead.
How are global leaders like yourself, Leonard Levin, Stefan Schmidt, making this idea viral? How is it being, besides...
How are we making this viral on a global level? I don't know that we have to make it viral. I think, we're more like an inoculation than a virus, if you think about it. I think things like this, everybody here is viral. It's the nature of the beast that we're viral. And the problem with our efficient mentality, I think, is that it's like looking at microbes. We go after microbes with such a vengeance, and yet our whole life is based on microbial activity. It's just truly amazing to me. It's like we're all going to go to the restroom, and then we're going to treat ourselves as if we're neurosurgeons or something and disinfect our hands, like we're ready to do some kind of complex surgery. And when you think of what an antiseptic is, how does our sewage treatment plant work? Septic tank, let's put antiseptic in there. So we go after, 1% of the microbes with a vengeance and kill the other 99% that we need so dramatically for our very survival. So I think from a viral perspective, we want to encourage as many viral enterprises as we possibly can. I think that's all we can do. But I think the best way is by just succeeding in our work, just doing our work, just quietly getting our work done. The problem is we have a desperate emergency on our hands. And if you're going to think 200 years, you have to realize that, as Al Gore pointed out, we are in deep, deep crisis right now. And imagine what it was like being among the founding fathers. And Jefferson said that it takes 5% of the thought leadership to cause a revolution. 5% of the thought leadership. So if we look at the thought leadership in this country, and let's say we have 300 million people, I mean, how many of those people have the privilege of being involved in thought leadership? And then what is 5% of those? It's not an unreasonable number to imagine getting focused on the same question. So I think we're going to need it pretty quickly, and that's how they got a revolution done. Think of what it takes to be ready to overthrow something that you held dear. It's an amazing time. Two thousand years hence. Well, that's a great question. If we do it, I think we could celebrate about 10 billion of us. I think that's about the level that we'll find we can support with biological and technical systems. And I think that we'll find that population will essentially level out based on the fact that women get treated equally to men. I think that's one of the greatest issues we have of our time. So I think that we'll see a world of safe, healthy things in closed cycles with people being able to share that. Because, like Mencius said in ancient China, full granaries yield peaceful times when everyone's granary is full. So I think we need to celebrate that abundance of the world. And that, I think, is consistent with the messages from 2,000 years ago, that the world is an abundant place, and it's a celebration of that abundance and that generosity. It's not a bemoaning of its limits. And so I think in order to give every child that's born hope, if we had systems that allowed us all to share the things. I mean, just think about materials that go to, as if I could sort of leave that plane for a minute and go to something as prosaic as a garbage dump. If you go to Manila and go to a garbage dump and you see these kids picking over it, looking for anything they can find, and you realize that a lot of this stuff is what we call garbage today, and a lot of it's unsafe and unhealthy and has no value, and they're picking through it. Imagine if everything there was either a soil amendment or a valuable material for industry. Everything. So that there's a value proposition in everything you do. And these are simple little things. We're looking at a product development right now where we're looking in India at these little sachets. They sell soap, like shampoos, in little tiny packets because people can't afford more than a rupee at a time. They can't afford to buy a big box of soap, for washing clothes. You get a little sachet and you sprinkle it on your clothes and you wash them. That's all you can afford to do. But the problem is everybody's excited that they can sell little bits of soap to poor people. But then you look at the packets, and they're everywhere. And they're in the stormwater. And they're down the Ganges and out to the Indian Ocean and so on. It's a terrifying thing. On the other hand, we can design that little packet so that it's nutrition for soil. So imagine the little kids going around picking them up and selling them. You know, you get enough of them, and then you say to somebody, here, put this in your dirt, it's nutrition. We could put a tiny bit of nitrogen in as a kicker for the farmer. But, those are the kinds of very simple designs that will allow us all to thrive. So we'll celebrate the abundance of soap instead of bemoan how many people got to wash their clothes and what a mess was left behind. Everything gets value. If everything has value, then that means that every one has value in relationship to those things. So we value everybody as well as everything. Yeah.
I love the wonderful picture on pine trees. The sunlight shining down through the wet. It's sad for me to see those same pine trees on the mountains somewhere and covered up by some of those wind machines that are also. Who gets to make the decision about
What a great question. The question, if I mess it up, correct it, okay? The question is, he loves looking at the evergreens, and then the question is, if they were on a mountaintop, would you want to see them covered with big wind machines? And who gets to make the decision of what is elegant in that context? It's a great question. I personally am really in favor of wind machines offshore, out of sight, what the admirals call the 13th mile, over the horizon. And I'm personally very excited about the windmills in the Great Plains. I think they look fabulous out there, and so do the farmers. Farmers like them, and the farmers put them up. So those are my favorite places for wind machines. I live on the Blue Ridge in Virginia, and personally, it would not be the ideal location to look at a wind machine from my perspective, no matter how much I like them. That doesn't mean that we can't solve the problem of renewable energy, because that wind is just one of the forms. And there are going to be places where it's appropriate and places it's not. That will have to be decided by local communities. When we talk to the Army Corps of Engineers about the wind question offshore, and they got responsibility for Horseshoe Shoal, the one off Nantucket, the famous battle that's going on up there, where these things can be seen from all these vacation houses that are so valuable. Anyway, the Army Corps of Engineers, it was decided, had the jurisdictional control over whether or not the permits were being granted. And it seemed to me that we should have the national authorities that need to be involved in things like this, like the Army Corps, in navigable waters and our various resources that are part of our public wheel. But they should get involved after the local communities have made their fundamental decisions about what they want and what they don't want. And then we can talk about the permitting process, rather than let them be the tar baby right at the beginning. So let me see if the question is, there are a whole series of initiatives that are underway here, and also including in sustainable housing. And the question is, what accelerants and what blockades have we seen to the sense of urgency, the ability to function with a sense of urgency? Okay, what accelerants have we seen, and what has held back blockades? Money. It's money. That's what we've seen. We get to do what we do because what we do is immensely profitable for the people for whom we do it. And when we come into a project, we're looking for fruit that's sitting on the ground, low-hanging fruit, ripe fruit, whatever kind of fruit we can find. But we would not have the approbation of our clients and customers if we weren't focused on their bottom line. And we look at long-term issues and short-term issues simultaneously. So in the housing area, for example, we can see certain forcing functions. We're doing a project right now in South Carolina where the developer is bringing in some of the big housing developers in the country to explore what sustainable housing looks like. That's the only way that people can have the project, is to be involved in our deep supply chain questions. And then you look for the volunteers, because you talked about people come in at a different level on the continuum. Some are completely ignorant, some are really there. And so what we'll see, for example, is the supply chain tool that we have that is going out to everybody. It gets three typical responses. Either someone says, this is the silliest thing I've ever heard of, or I'm a curmudgeon, I don't want anything to do with it, and that's fine. The second response is, I think this is fascinating, and I'd love to participate. How do I get to know more so I can participate? And then the third are people like Herman Miller and that chair that's out there, where they say, oh, I've already done this, I have the checklist all ready to go, I'm with you. So those are the three responses. So people are on that continuum. Either they're all the way there or they're all the way not, and somewhere in between. And then we look for the people who volunteer to be active. And then we work with them, because it's like a friend of mine once said, you never want to teach a mule to play the violin, because it sounds terrible and the mules don't like it. So we go where you go where you want it, and go fast, because we don't have time to beat the mule over the head with a 2x4. Look for the thoroughbreds and run. Yep. Use tires. Right. Tire manufacturing. Closed loop tire, yeah, they're in circles. Michael Braungart is a much better person to talk to. He's very focused on tires. I haven't been that focused on tires. I really wonder on the tire thing, what we've seen, and it's a real big one. I mean, it's a huge question. But I think on the tire question, we're seeing the issues be, size of particulates that come off of them, things like that. But as far as their end use, I mean, for the interim, fuel is what we're seeing them being used for. It's not an inappropriate interim use. The question will become, how do we sequester the carbon? One of the things we were looking at this morning is that the most commonly used coal gasification technology apparently can be used with almost any hydrocarbon or carbohydrate now without having to steam reform for hydrogen. And so we're fascinated that it looks like we could take things even like tires and use them to make synthetic natural gas and then ultimately hydrogen with very simple add-ons to this sort of plug-in strategy, if we could sequester the carbon. And I think that as a species, we're probably going to develop carbon sequestration scaled technology at the same level we do fuel distribution. So in the same way we have pipelines that move gas around, I think we'll have pipelines that take the carbon to sequestration. And then we'll start to put the things where we can sequester the carbon. So it might be the kind of thing where we say that the repository for tires while we combust them would be near carbon sinks, for example. So we could go ahead and combust them in the interim. But the other thing is, recycled rubber is a phenomenally valuable material in our context for lots of other things. I mean, it's great for house siding, for roofing. There are a lot of things you can do with recycled rubber. And the issue of putting it back in tires, we were just talking about that earlier. One of the gentlemen here and I were talking about it. If we force feed the system and say it has to have recycled content, we might be, looking at through the wrong end of the telescope. We might want to look at tires and say they can be, clean raw material, and then they have this other lives that they're designed for, so that we make sure we ensure the safety and the quality of the components. Because if we take old stuff that isn't optimal and put it into the new stuff, we're contaminating the new stuff, in a way. A good example is the carpet industry. We've been working in the carpet industry for 10 years, and we've worked with all the different carpet companies. And the first ones we worked with got all excited and said, "Oh, we love your technical and nutrient idea. We'll treat our carpets as a service. Mea culpa, mea culpa. We'll figure this out." And the problem is that they still make PVC. They still make PVC carpet. So it's fine that they want to take on the closed cycle, but we don't work with them now because they still make PVC. They haven't dedicated to get out of PVC. And then they go to things like U.S. Green Building Council and say you have to have recycled content as a metric in order to get points for LEED under this LEED standard that the U.S. Green Building Council has done, which we're working very closely with them now on bringing Cradle to Cradle into LEED. And what's interesting is that by forcing the recycled content standard, what they're forcing is the recycling of PVC. And Michael and I are interested in recycling PVC. We see no purpose in recycling cancer because it's what we call products plus. You get the carpet plus cancer. I want the carpet. You can keep the cancer. So the carpet we did with Shaw dedicated themselves to get out of PVC, which is a beautiful thing. So now the carpet lines are completely cleaned up. But they don't contain recycled content. Because if they did, they'd be contaminated. See the problem? So in the transitions, we have long-term transitions we have to take on, but there's some meta-design where we need real public policy leadership, like the sequestration of carbon, like technological ramp-ups at high speed. But there are other subtle things, like this recycled content question, that really need to be looked at carefully in a cradle-to-cradle way, not in some reactionary way that recycled is good. Because most products that are recycled are not recycled, they're downcycled. They lose quality in the process. The clear bottle becomes the park bench on its way to a landfill. It's losing its quality through the system. And it's suboptimal design. This is polyethylene terephthalate, and it contains antimony residues from a catalytic reaction. Okay? And antimony is it's not in the recipe for PET, it's in the catalyst, and yet there's a residue. So if I burn this in India to make tea, because it's really energy, look at how much energy is in this thing. This is pure energy other than water. And I could burn this, but I would get antimony trioxide, which is a well-known carcinogen. So someone gets the bottle, as an energy source, they're in trouble. So we can design this without the antimony. So at that point, we wouldn't want recycled content. See what I mean? You're contaminating the flow. What we really want to do with existing PET is what we call upcycle it, ultimately. This might take us 1,000 years to get to the other gentleman's question, because this will take a long time, really a long time. But it's like the Chinese say, when is the best time to start something, that's an emergency? It was right now. When it's exactly the right time to start. It was right now. Thank you.